morning and welcome to the show. You are tuned into News Magazine on Kantanka TV with me, Irbadi Ibrahim, and it's quite a very sunny day here in Accra. The temperature stands at around 25 degrees Celsius. For our viewers back home, we wish you a pleasant breakfast, and those watching us in various offices across the country, a very productive working week. There is news buzz everywhere. Interesting headlines and interesting stories online. We go for a quick commercial break. When we come back, Abena will introduce us to the headlines. Stick and stay with us. You're welcome back, and thanks for continuing to be with us. I'm still here with Abena Safo. Abena, what do you have for us by way of headlines?
Well, I do have a lot of trending news from our various portals, but I'll quickly take you there and then give out what we have on our trending news portals. Okay, this one is from City News. Court grants injunction against NCA. Styles attempt to reclassify radio station frequencies.
I think the issue of the number of radio stations we have in Ghana is quite interesting. We have well over 400. And some say this country is too small for us to have as many radio stations. Countries like Kenya and Tanzania don't have as many as we do. But when it comes to the spectrum that is used, you can be a community radio station, you can be a commercial one. There's been a lot of debate about the overlap in terms of the mandate every radio station has. So therefore, it's quite refreshing that the courts are passing judgment, so to speak, on some of these issues.
Okay. Well, and I quickly move you to the second one. This one says U.S. and Canada agree new trade deal. What's your take? Do you really think this is necessary?
The U.S. and Canada are neighboring countries. They are pretty much like Ghana and Togo, but the United States has a bigger GDP, so to speak.
Okay.
And they have quite a protectionist and isolationist leader in the person of President Donald Trump. That is why all the time you hear him say, America first, America first.
Oh, I see.
But there are some inequalities in terms of trade tariffs, and he wants to iron that out with Justin Trudeau, who is the current Prime Minister of Canada. So it's refreshing that after all the deadlock, they seem to have made a breakthrough.
Okay. This is actually from Al Jazeera. This one says South Africa highly divided over relaxed cannabis laws.
Oh, this story is back again. Prominent people in the country like Kwame Sefakine and others have mooted the idea that Ghana can now legalize marijuana. But ganja has got its own, consideration in Ghana, considering the fact that our mental health system is quite weak. When you go to the US in the state of Colorado, you can actually take cannabis. But then what is the repercussion? This is a hungry guy who can't afford 3 square meals. And therefore, adding that to your brain in terms of charged chemical reactions could easily make you insane. And when you go insane, do we have the proper mental, medical arrangement to take care of such people? So for me, from where I stand, I think it will be too early for Ghana to consider legalizing marijuana. Some have argued it can be used commercially, so we produce in large quantities for external revenue or hard currencies like the US dollar. I think it's not a good idea at this opportune moment.
Well, but I think I have a friend who actually says when he takes in this marijuana, he sees angels. So, well, I think...
For angels, I'm not too sure, but you feel high. I've never tried it before anyway.
Anyway, quickly we move to this another story. This one says that Nigerian governing party set to confirm Buhari as 2019 presidential candidate.
They say power is sweet, and everybody who comes in and says, okay, I'm here to fight corruption, I'm here to do one term and then put the system right, after one term they want to stay. Muhammadu Buhari is just like our own president, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. From all indications, each of them would want to do 8 years. But the dynamics in Nigeria currently are quite dicey. I just returned from Abuja. It looks like Buhari will have a run for his money. So 2019 is a year to watch in the elections in Nigeria.
But do you really think this whole...
No. He campaigned. I get you. He campaigned on the idea of fighting against corruption, and he's done so well. He streamlined the system. But fighting corruption does not provide petrol, which is a scarce commodity on the Nigerian market. It doesn't provide potable water. It doesn't necessarily put people back to school where they can't afford education. So you should go beyond the mantra that you fight corruption and all other problems within the continent or a country are solved. And I think some Nigerians are disappointed that the promises that were made in the manifesto of the APC, which was the party on whose ticket Buhari got elected, made them in the lead up to the election in 2015.
Okay, but do you think democracy in Africa is really helping us?
That is a huge debate. Colonel Gaddafi was the leader of Libya. There wasn't too many of democratic credentials. Libya was doing quite well. Ghana and Nigeria, we've had the most elections. We've changed the governments the most south of the Sahara. But still, there are Ghanaians and Nigerians who, as we speak this morning, are traveling through the desert to go to Libya. So it leaves much to be desired.
Okay. We move quickly to another one. This is from My Joy Online. Zambia deported renowned Pan-African Prof. Lumumba for speaking up against China.
Patrice Lumumba seems to be striking a chord with young, educated Africans. That is why when you go to various campuses, people watch him on YouTube a lot, and people share some of his views on WhatsApp and other social media portals. But it's one thing to appeal to the masses, and it's another thing to appeal to the ruling elite. And it looks like the Zambian authorities are not too comfortable with some of the ideas he shares. It's quite a shame he's been repatriated from a sister African country.
I know. So far, I think this is what we have for you today. And we'll be looking forward to having your comments in our subsequent...
Yes, Abuna will come back shortly after our interview with Anis Hafa to discuss preschool, the condition of preschool in the Republic of Ghana currently, to read some of your comments. So keep them coming on all our social media handles. We'll go for a quick commercial break. When we come back, I sit with Anis Hafa. Stick and stay with us. welcome back. My colleague Abina Safo will be back shortly to read your messages on all our social media platforms. So keep them coming on Twitter, Facebook, and all other platforms. And we delve into our interview segment, and today we are discussing the state of preschool education in the Republic of Ghana. And we have in the studio founder of Education Matters Foundation, no stranger to the screens here in Ghana and elsewhere, Mr. Anis Hafa. Sir, thank you so much for making time.
My pleasure.
Sir, it is said that history is a teacher of many lessons. How do you compare the state of Ghana's education now and during the colonial era?
Well, you know, I schooled in the colonial era. I started school, I believe, in the mid-1950s in a village called Tutuka in Obuasi.
Yes.
And that was the colonial education. And we were taught by people who, at the time, I'm sure couldn't even speak English properly. We didn't speak any English. We came from a culture where we just spoke Ghanaian languages. We're in Obuasi area, yes, and we all spoke Twi.
Okay.
So the emphasis really was on the local language. The local language meaning the language that we kids were familiar with and comfortable with. So we're taught in the Twi language. But I'll tell you what happened as a result of that was that we learned how to read and write in Twi. So we got an idea of what language means. We began to understand the language can be written, it can be read, so that others can read and also understand it. So that was the extent of the colonial education. But what I also want to add is that there was a lot of supervision. You know, our school was just one room in the middle of the bush. There were no toilets, no internet facilities, no electricity, none of that. But for some reason, our parents were committed for our education, and they were very instrumental in getting us prepared in the morning. I remember my grandmother would put powder on my face for me to look good, but as soon as I came outside, I wiped it off. You know. But then there was the support system, even though she herself had never schooled before.
Okay.
But then there was a lot of supervision, like I said, in terms of how instruction was delivered.
Okay.
Supervisors were visible. They would be in the hallway, peering through the windows to see if the teachers were doing the right things, and also to be in a supportive position. You know, so by the time in 1 year in a village, I could read and write Twi, and there was a newspaper that we were reading at the time called Nkwantabisa, which was in Twi. But then I moved on to Kumasi in 1957 after Ghana's independence. That was the crossing over from colonial to our independence. And I started class 3 there. I mean, I was tested and jumped from class 1 to class 3, coming from a village, because the focus was, we didn't have much, but there was dedicated teachers at the time. So I think that's a glimpse of the transition from the colonial to the independence. And frankly, looking back and you asking the question now, I'm glad that I saw the colonial element and also the independence element.
Okay, wonderful. I think we'll look at education in broad strokes, and then we zero down to preschool education. Today we talk about schools under trees, teachers going on strikes because of delayed payments. Did you experience those even though you were very, very young? Did the British also face those challenges in your time?
You know, that's a good question. The school that I went to in Obuasi was a Catholic school. So there was pride of ownership. You know, there were other schools there like St. Joseph's, but it was 4. So they started St. John's, which is where I started class 1. So they were quite keen on making sure that we could read and write. And I guess the idea was that once you can read and write, then you can also read the Bible. You know, so there was also that motive. But then besides that, you know, we had music, we had mathematics, and so on. But there was something else too. In terms of how, when I spoke about ownership of a school, even when we were small, of course, when I was in class, when I was about 7, those days, what they would do, that they would get you to cross your hands over your head.
A very crude way of
And if you can
selection.
touch your ears, then you
You
are
are
ready
fit
for school.
to start.
And I remember, if you are not ready, you have your mothers trying to push your hand, push your hand to touch your ears,
So you could
because they
start
wanted you out.
prematurely.
They want you out of the house.
Yeah.
But then the point is this, and you bringing back memories now, and I appreciate that. I remember that we took our school as an oasis of excellence. And what that meant is that on the weekends, we're out in the bushes, cutting bamboo,
Wow.
so that we can build a boundary around our school so that the goats won't come in and eat the flowers that were growing. And thinking about it now, the school meant a lot to us. We weren't rich. Nobody was rich those days. But then the school meant something to us. And also on the weekends, to make money for the school, what we used to do, okay, we lived in compound houses. We go to the back of the compound houses where people, where mothers have made their palm soup, and they've thrown the kennels outside the house.
Yeah.
So we go to pick them up and crack the shells and release the nuts. And we will present that every Monday morning. Where in 4 sections, excuse me, red, blue, gold, and green.
Okay.
So we are laid that way.
Yeah.
And they had a big bucket where they call you,
Okay.
and you deposit
Okay.
your nuts in there, and that was marketed.
Wow.
I don't think they got much money for it, but it was marketed to support the school.
So it taught children at that very tender age the can-do spirit, you would say.
That's exactly what it is. So, I mean, going back now, and then, my training has taken me all over the country. I mean, training teachers has taken me all over the country, from Accra all the way to Mamprusi area, Narigu, and Wa. And then you realize that people tend to be aloof. They see themselves removed from the environment where they are supposed to get education. And for me, it's a little disappointing, because we have to own the school. Like I said, it has to be our own oasis of excellence. And then also, when you begin to see that your contribution matters, it doesn't matter how young or how old you are, your contribution matters, then you grow up with what we call a shared responsibility. That this is where you are, what is that you can add in terms of value to the environment that's raising
So
you.
at that time, the British governor and the colonial government did not have any stake. It was the missionaries that ran those schools.
Yeah, frankly, at the beginning, I don't think, colonial system is exploitative. So our well-being wasn't as important to them when you talk about an imperial agency than the churches. Because the churches have some element of empathy, for younger people, for the environment and so on. So the schools, I mean, all the way even now that you mentioned the missions, I went to Franspem after St. Peter's in Kumasi, Cape Coast. And the schools were established in 1876 by the Methodist Church. So what we can say right from the get is that schools in the colonies, especially as far as I'm concerned, in the Gold Coast colony, were established by the missionaries. But then they had an ulterior motive to raise people for the clergy, to be pastors, to be church people, to read the Bible, and that sort of thing. So at the beginning, education was for that purpose. It wasn't for industry.
Okay, we'll pretty shortly delve into contemporary issues, but some have argued that when it comes to preschool, we can only concentrate on language and arithmetic. Don't you feel sad that we saddle children at very tender age to a barrage of subjects to learn? Would you be a proponent of the idea that at preschool level, teach them language and numbers?
Well, numbers are difficult, but language is easier. That is why it's good to start young people with the languages that they are comfortable with, and invariably is the mother tongue, especially coming from the environment where I grew up. My grandmother spoke. I live with my grandmother. She spoke Fanti, And what she will say is this, and let me tell you this, Mfanti. Also, Anis, many bibi amzumo. Ada amzumo wanye kasa. And they say, Eko baby na say kasa. Ka fantini ye na no honso. No who if that is how she regarded her own culture. But then she said something else, that pay attention to the languages that are spoken by the people you are with. If they speak Twi and we're in Kumasi, so excuse me, Obuasi, so we learn Twi, and I could speak it very well.
Yes, sir.
But what she said is this: if your friends speak Hausa, learn to speak it. If they speak Awana, Ewe, learn to speak it. If they speak Dagomba, learn to speak it. And then she summarized all that by saying that don't forget to learn English, because Mama Uyem Fudebesuya Abrovakasa, because they be Anandas Bobobra. Like, learn to speak the English language as well, because one day the chances are that's how you're going to elevate your own status, by getting into the foreign language. But the point is this: my grandmother never went to school in her life, but she understood one thing, that children have the cognitive ability to learn as many languages as possible. But then, of course, you have to hear it. You know, when you hear it, it sinks in, and hearing it and the actions and the emotions that go with language, you begin to develop an appreciation for what language is. But back to your question again, it will be a bit too early in the preschool ages. Remember, in our time, again, like when I started school, I must have been about 7. I've gone beyond the preschool, nursery, kindergarten, that sort of thing. But these days, when you begin to look at best practices, you begin to understand that pre-primary education in terms of nursery, kindergarten is very, very important, because that's where we begin to form values. That's when we learn to share things. That's when we learn to say thank you. That's when we learn to say please. That's when we begin to develop social skills. But they are not academic skills. These are skills that are called the affective skills. Skills that teach you leadership, that teach you respect, that teach you honesty. All of that now have to be packaged for preschool setting. And I think we're getting there. You know, there was a time where we were looking at K through 12. Now it's preschool through K through 12. So the idea is that we are looking at best practice to see how we can begin to nurture our young people. But then the question comes, are we sufficiently prepared in terms of material, in terms of the expertise of your people who are going to teach these particular subjects?
That's quite a very good angle to look at it. Most couples are now corporate, because Ghana is becoming a very popular middle income country. Daddy goes to work, the mom also finds her way into a formal working environment. So do we see preschool as a safe haven to dump the kids away, rather than a place where they should get all the basics you are talking about, learning to share, learning to be gregarious, learning to interact and all that? Do we dump them there because they have to be away from home, or there should be a grand motive why we do that?
I'll use your expression. There has to be a grand motive. I haven't used that expression before. We never want to dump people. But unfortunately, it happens in places where, you know, can you imagine dumping a child? What that means is that there's carelessness. What that means is that there's no affection. What that means then, in terms of dumping, is that they are not the right facilities and so on. So I would never suggest to this country that we dump kids. Now remember, kids, what I keep saying is this: the way we raise children foretells the future of any country. Show me how a nation is raising its children, and I will show you where the future of that country is going to go. But I've always been dissatisfied in terms of the culture. You know, I've had the opportunity to teach in other countries. I've had the opportunities to teach other nationalities. I've traveled quite widely. And when I come back home, I get a bit disappointed in terms of the respect that the culture has for young people. And, you know, I've written about that quite extensively, that we have to learn how to love our children. Anyway, You have something in mind?
No, no.
We have, we have to learn how to love our children.
Okay.
And loving your children means this. I've had parents come to me many times and say that I'm planning to send my child to school A, B, or C. Which one would I recommend for them? And my response is very simple. Go to A, B, and C school. The first thing you do, check their toilet facilities. Are they hygienic? Check where the kids sit to eat, and check the food that they're eating. Are they hygienic? Check the training of the people that you're going to leave your kids with. And then out of those three, now you make up your own mind. Because I'm sure you love your kids. And for the period that you're gone, and you're talking about we live in a corporate world now, and you might be gone all day.
All day.
This is the environment in which your children are going to be in. Are you pleased with it? If you are not pleased with it, then of course don't send your kids there.
Okay.
So the point I'm raising is that when it comes to hygiene, it's very, very important that now we begin to live up to the expectation. You know, we can't live the way I was brought up, you know, where if you have to use facility, you go into the bush and use yourself there. Things have changed. We can't do that in the 21st century. But unfortunately, in many places, that's what we're doing. So it begs the question that since our independence since 1957, when I was 10 years old in primary school, we still have these very unacceptable practices. I mean, we have to be ashamed of it.
Okay, we'll go shortly for a commercial break, but I'll ask you this. Much as we revel in the idea that economically some Ghanaian couples are doing better, a large chunk of this population continues to live below the poverty line. You're talking about the quality of washrooms, the quality of food fed the kids in preschool. What recommendation would you make for a low-income family? Can children get good preschool education even though their parents don't have the big bucks to pay for that education?
You want me to respond to
Yeah,
now?
low budget. Can there be a low-budget preschool setting?
You know, the idea, I don't like excuses. The idea is for us to begin to understand the needs of a child. It doesn't matter whether you're a low budget or whatever it is. Where there's a will, there's a way. But the will has to be mainstreamed in a culture. And I always come back to that. That if I look at a primary school that I went to in Kumasi, I mean, those days, we used what they call the bomba latrine. And we refused to use it, you know, because it wasn't hygienic enough. This was 1957. You go back now to the schools in Kumasi. I went to a school called St. Peter's. There were schools around St. Joseph's, ECM, ASIM, Methodist schools, and so on. They haven't really advanced in terms of our hygienic needs. And then you ask yourself, is it lack of money or it's lack of attention? The two are very different. When you are attentive to the needs of the human being, then you find ways to make those correctives. But if the culture itself does not promote that, then that sits in the back burner. That is how we have to begin to look at it. We have, in that environment, and I keep talking about Kumasi because that's where I grew up. When there's a funeral, money comes from everywhere. You know, people are bleaching their skins, buying wigs, and all sorts of things. And people are buying big cloth for funerals and so on. That is the emphasis of the culture. So there's room for that. But how come, when it comes to hygienic needs, then we don't have the means and the propulsion to make those things happen? We have to really begin to question the culture. And, you know, what I keep saying is this. You know, I teach a course in critical thinking, that you can never be a critical thinker unless you begin to examine your own beliefs and question those beliefs and ask yourselves if the beliefs are taking you to the places where you want to go in the future.
On this interesting note, we'll go for a quick commercial break. We'll be back shortly. Stick on. welcome back. Today we are discussing the state of preschool education in Ghana and its impact on social development. And we couldn't have had a better guest than Mr. Anis Hafa, founder of Education Matters Foundation. So, before we went on the break, you were talking about prioritization. We would rather want to splash money on funerals rather than on the education of our wards. Do you know that preschool costs more than high school education in some cases now?
Well, it depends. It depends on how you want to set up a preschool. It depends on how you want to set up a high school. Both of them have demanding needs. For example, if preschool, you want to make sure that you have the right urinals, for example, for children,
Okay.
the right toilets, and so on. It costs money. You want to make sure that there are places where children can have siesta and be comfortable, blankets, that sort of thing, and also playing things. You know, you need to have all that. But that's preschool. There's a cost to it. Now, if you want to have a good high school, there's a cost to that too.
Okay.
In terms of the kind of equipment that you want to have young people use to develop skills. You see, we don't have those things here. So we don't really have skills. Skills meaning that an aptitude to be able to do something with your learning. Okay. Here, we do just the academics. You know, you were saying that earlier, do mathematics on the chalkboard, English language, history, geography, and all of that. That's fantastic. But then when it comes to sciences and the application of sciences, you begin to need equipment. And these days, of course, if you want to have a computer lab, these are very expensive. So when you put all that in perspective, I would imagine that to be more expensive than the needs of preschooling. So we have to put that in perspective. But the concern, though, is that, again, we are looking at education to the future. We realize that by the time a person has gone through all the way through university education, they have a piece of paper to show that they've gone through particular kinds of learning up to now. But people hardly have skills. Okay. Skills are the things that you can do with your education. Not for you to recite theories to me. Because, I mean, if I came here in this studio, you need people with skills, with cameras, you know, and that sort of thing, lighting, and so on. These are skills that people need to have. But we don't have that in the education system. But we need to have that. So it depends, again, coming back to your question in terms of cost, it depends on how you define primary, it depends on how you define kindergarten, preschooling, primary, lower level primary education, higher level primary education, junior high school education, and senior high school and university. Each one of these entities have very defined needs, you know, and each need costs money. But it depends on where we want to station our priorities and then find the means of making sure that at every level we develop our young people to the highest standards. But the question is this, though. We should never underestimate the abilities of young people, especially in their formative ages. And we've spoken about that in terms of the kindergarten, lower primary, and so on. But the teenage years are very important because the things that we learn in our teenage years, the chances are those are the skills that will take us into the future. Okay. You know, it's really disappointing that we have people who come out of the universities with fantastic degrees, but they are not skillful. Skill, again, like I said, it's what is it that you can do with your education, not to repeat to me the things that you've learned, but what it is that you can do. So these are the elements that we have to begin to consider as we look at a broader picture of education of our young people. And that's very important to me personally, because programs that I've done when I was teaching what you call a GATE program, Gifted and Talented Education in the state of California, for example, we're looking at how we're going to develop our youngsters to have uncommon sense. Now, there's a big difference between having common sense and having uncommon sense. Uncommon sense is what sets you apart from other people. You know, Picasso used to say that if you see only the things that everybody sees, you are not a genius.
Wow.
A genius is the person who has uncommon sense and can begin to look at things that need to be looked at, but with a certain kind of clarity and a certain kind of vision. So when you really begin to look at education properly, you want to, who are we going to develop? Are we going to develop people who are all mainstreamed, all thinking the same way, like a herd? Or are we going to take into account people's natural aptitudes and develop everyone in terms of where they should go that is of use to them? You know, these are the considerations if we want to look at what we call quality education.
Anis, you are an expert on this area. I'll ask you this. You are an educationist. Chances are 9 cases out of 10, you would want your kids to toe your line. And there is a father who is a lawyer. He wants his son to grow up a lawyer or an engineer or anything like that. At preschool level, is it possible to find out the idiosyncratic capabilities of kids to want to give them the long rope to decide what they become in future?
That's a wonderful question, and I'm glad you've asked it. Now, then we go back into your theory of education. And there are 3 wonderful people that I would like to mention. Let me give you, before I mention them, let me give you an instance. Many times, let's say I'm 30 years old and I'm teaching a 10-year-old kid. We expect the 10-year-old kid to understand us who are 30. Now that's setting psychology upside down, because the thing is this: if you want a 10-year-old child to understand a 30-year-old person, then our assumption is that those kids have lived another 20 years to be at par. So what we do is this: we need to understand the people that you're teaching. And that takes into consideration the question that you're asking. Because we have been 10, if I'm 30, I've been 10 years before. So I understand the dynamics of being 10 years old. That comes back to the 3 people that I want to mention. I'm sure you've heard of Maria Montessori.
Yeah, a very popular name.
Her concern is that it's my business to begin to understand children at that earliest age. We want to know who they are. And you'll be surprised. If you have 30 kids at your disposal, we have 30 different human beings at your disposal. You know, there are certain things that we teach that are standard. But then we also want to begin to look at the non-standard aspects of every human being. It takes a lot of sophistication to be able to get there. And the other person I also want to mention is a Swiss educationist called Jean Piaget. He took it upon himself to understand his own children. The point is this: when you understand your children, that's when you begin to see what natural aptitudes are. What are their natural curiosities? What is it that moves them? What are their interests? Now remember, interests and aptitudes can change, but that's not the point. The point is that we have to be in a position to identify them early enough, and then surround them with a sort of materials, the enthusiasm, motivation, and inspiration that will drive the best out of them. That is where we are thinking. That's also the concerns of another educator by the name of Dewey. He was American. These are the people who set the parameters in terms of what we as educators have to look for in human beings. And then you mention it. We start at the very beginning. But then the needs begin to change. People evolve, you know. So it's not a matter of you trying to force your interest in someone else's direction. It doesn't work that way. It's possible that, let's say I'm a teacher, my children might be teachers, but the chances are they might want to be something else. But then the idea is this: what will serve the superior interest of the people under our purview, the people that we are growing, so to speak. And then, you know, there was a time where people had to be either doctors, engineers, and nurses, and so on. But you see how things have changed now. Now, the issue is this: we are even raising people into professions that have not been defined yet. That's where critical thinking comes in, where we begin to look at uncommon sense in terms of what we can perceive the needs of the next 5 years, the needs of the next 10 years, the needs of the next 20 years and prepare ourselves accordingly. So what has happened in this day and age is that computers are giving us opportunities
Yes, sir.
to explore things that haven't been explored yet.
Yes, sir.
You know, what Robert Frost, a poet, used to say, go the way where others haven't been. You know, the uncharted territory. You know, all of that is where civilization is heading.
Okay.
That where are the possibilities now?
Okay.
So all these things have to be factored factored into account so that we are not unduly
Yes, sir.
stressing our young people to go places where they don't want
And
to go.
it's a very exhilarating discussion. I wish we had 2 more hours, but we are beginning to wrap up. I'll ask you this. You made a very good point, educating our kids for the future. Would you recommend robotics as a mainstream course of study at all levels of our education? This should be your final words, sir.
That's it. Artificial intelligence is where it's at. You know, so, and kids are very interested in that too. Where, again, what robots do, they'll go to places where human beings don't want to go. You know, even in terms of mining and so on. These days, even in terms of medicine, I mean, it's everywhere. So we have to begin to introduce that, that we are not going to mainstream everyone for the academics of old, but to look into the future in terms of where our needs are.
A very wonderful discussion we've had in the studio. Anis Hafa, founder of Education Matters Foundation. Sir, thank you so much for making time.
Thank you.
We go for our final commercial break. When we come back, my colleague Abena reads some of your messages. Stick and stay with us.
You to Apostle Safo School of Arts and Sciences, Great Asas. At Great Asas, we give your word not just literacy, but all-round education in both theory and practice. We have from crèche to junior high school. We also have the senior high department, which offers general arts, general science, technical science with options in applied electricity and auto mechanics. Great Asas also offers business, home economics, and visual arts. Students have the opportunity to get hands-on training at the Apostle Safo Suaye during the long vacation. The school also has an exchange program with the Ulsan National Institute of Science and Technology based in South Korea. Our state-of-the-art science and ICT laboratories give the school an edge over others. We also have boarding facilities for your ward in a serene environment. Locate us at Awoshi Last Stop, Accra, Ghana. At Great Asas, we train your ward to become an asset for national development. Great Asas.
You're welcome back to the final segment of this show, which is the social media interview. And I have on standby my colleague, Abena Safo. Loads of questions were coming from social media enthusiasts. Abena, what do you have? Are there any questions for our guest, Anis?
Yes, I do have a lot of questions and comments coming from our various platforms. This one says, Kansanka TV is really doing well. This is from Anoche Ibri. Another one says, I want to find out if the concept of preschool really championed the main idea behind preschool in the world at large. This is from Nana Edu, Tamale Market area. And
I don't know whether this idea of preschool, has it been there since time immemorial? Is there a global model for it? I believe that's the question from Abenes, you know.
Well, I don't think there's been a global model for it, but the necessity is presented itself. And because I remember when I was teaching the US, preschool was private. You can go from a grade, how do you call it, first grade all the way to senior high school for free. But the preschool education was private, you know. But then parents took their kids there because of what you were saying earlier. The corporate needs, like I was working full-time, my wife was working full-time, so we have to find a place to put them. But now it's been mainstreamed. So these are best practices that are catching up everywhere else. That is why Ghana, I'm pleased that Ghana is part of the system now.
Okay. Abena, what are the messages?
well, I think another one goes to another question for Mr. Anis. Isaac from Kumasi, what integral role does language play in our educational system?
You spoke quite copiously about language. I'm sure when your daughters, your three beautiful daughters were kids, you were speaking English to them.
Yeah.
Would you recommend the Akan language or the Ewe language or the Dagbanli language at the preschool level?
You know, when it comes to local language, it's so important to me because that's how I grew up. You need to be confident in terms of expressing opinions and so on, but then you are competent in a way that is suitable to you, the mother tongue. So what I really insist is that parents should make sure that whatever language that they speak, their children need to understand it. And I'll tell you, I brought two of my kids, I brought them to Ghana specifically to learn a Ghanaian language, even though two of them were born in the US. Ghanaian language is very, very important. What it does is that it establishes a certain confidence for you. You know, these days, we can speak English. It's easier to speak English now than before. But people who are speaking English now don't now understand their mother tongue in many cases, especially in the middle-class families. Mm-hmm. I've taught in private schools where the children, parents will tell you, they have to they have to be able to speak.
Doesn't that pose a danger to our culture in the future?
You know, I think so. You know, but you know, when we look at the new curriculum that's been developed now, there's a great emphasis in the local languages. But the point is this: we shouldn't wait for bureaucracy. Okay. For the parents who are hearing me, they have to make sure that in addition to English, kids need to be able to speak English. No two ways about it. Because you go on the internet, you go on YouTube, you go on their Facebook and that sort of thing. English is the prime medium, especially even in business. But for human beings' cognitive development, I think every mother, every father have to be sure to teach their children their language. But that's their responsibility. We should not leave that to some bureaucracy to do for them.
Okay, Abena, back to you.
Yeah, this message is from Daniel. Daniel says, Kansanka TV, you're really doing well. I love the show. Keep it up. And another one says, this is from Dede from Takrady. I think our authorities are not doing enough for the subject matter. And the third one is actually a question again. He says, does our culture have any role to play on our education? This is from Emmanuel from Cantonment.
Basic things like when you meet an elderly person, greet. And when you sit in a bus and an elderly person comes, surrender your seat to them. These are missing. in our educational setting today? What role can culture play in bringing
Right.
back?
You know, frankly, those are the sophisticated parts of our culture, the respect for the elders. But then the elders abuse it. And let me tell you why.
How do you mean?
Yeah,
Yes.
okay, now, you know, I want to tell you this. You know, the United Nations came out with what we call the 3 Ps. The first P is that children have the right for protection, which adults have to afford for them. Children have to have the right for provision, which means that whatever children need, we have to be able to fulfill those needs for them. And then the right one, the third one, the right of participation, which is what is missing in the culture. In a sense that, I remember when we were growing up, and you get a wrong answer, 2 times 2, and you say 6, you get hit on the head. You know, we're abused mercilessly, slapped, kicked, insulted, and so on. That was the part of the culture that has to stop.
Okay.
You know, we have absolute disrespect for young people in this culture. That has to stop so that the children can now begin to understand what it means to be cultured. That element have to be stopped by adults, not by children.
Anis is so prolific, Abena. I believe there will be another opportunity to bring Anis back. Maybe 1 or 2 more, not questions anyway, then we wrap up the show.
Well, this is from Daniel. Daniel says, Kantanka TV, you do all. Keep this show up, and I would always follow you.
Okay. So on that note, we come to the end of this edition of the show. We were privileged, as always, to have had a very resourceful guest, Anis Hafta, founder of Education Matters Foundation, and I've been in the studios with my colleague, Abina Safo. My name is Irbad Ibrahim. So we come your way next time. Keep praying for Mother Africa and keep watching Kantanka TV.